Okay, so tonight's event is going to be special for me, especially because of the fact that I'm going to introduce two of my colleagues and longtime friends now. I was just thinking about it right now. You know, can you imagine? It's more than 10 years. It's almost 12 years now. And we have two distinguished scholars here. I will start with Dr. McKenzie, Kelly McKenzie. And Dr. McKenzie conducted research, delivered presentations, and taught courses in Mexico, Sweden, and France. Her recent presentation, Narrowing the Leadership Gap Using Communication Strategies to Mitigate Microaggressions, was delivered in Brussels, Belgium. She has presented her research on women leaders in higher education at the Universidad Autónoma de Sinaloa and conducted research on women in the information technology field in Guadalajara, Mexico. It was in Mexico that she used teleconferencing technology to join college students in the United States and with college students in Mexico to discuss NAFTA and immigration policy. So that would be very interesting. I wish I was there. Her interest in living and learning in an international context began apparently very early age of 6. So when she moved from Pennsylvania to Calgary, Canada. So that must have been some kind of a change. Many years later, when she earned her Bachelor's of Art degree in communication from Cal State San Bernardino, she sold her car and used her savings to backpack Europe. Okay. That's another thing I would like to do with you again. And her most recent research on impact of memorable messages on perceptions of sexism was conducted in Lund, Sweden, when she was there. So I think that speech is going to be related to that. Well, it's time for the other Dr. McKenzie. Dr. McKenzie is the chair of the Department of Communication. And I think if you look at the records, that this is really crazy. I mean, he took students almost everywhere in 25 years. Look at this record of countries where he taught the course Comparative Media in France, England, Mexico, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, St. Croix, China, and most recently in Sweden. I wanted to go with him to Sweden, but maybe I'm going to do it this summer. Who knows? And he has taught comparative media here as well. And when he teaches here on campus, he actually takes time to take his students to Toronto and Montreal. And they visit Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and they look at the Canadian media. They drive there together. So must have been a fun trip. So published by his book, Comparing Media Around the World, is published by Pearson Publishing. And then what he did was basically he traveled 3 different countries to interview government officials, media professionals, and media scholars. So that's basically the content of his book. He's the son of a Scottish father. I believe he was an anarchist. I kind of agree with his father. An English mother, who's here, Pat, who introduced him to love of combining travel with education. So please join me to welcome these two esteemed scholars.
Let's go. Thank you very much, Jim, and welcome everybody. We're so pleased to be here as part of this series, this colloquium symposium series that the provost has put together. It's a wonderful thing for a university to be able to offer and to see it rejuvenated like it's been this year. It's also for me very pleasing to be here with my colleague Jem Zeytinoglu. But most pleasing is the idea that we're here to talk to you about our study abroad experience in Sweden, the beautiful, wonderful country of Sweden. And we've designed our presentation today to have an appeal to a few different kinds of people who we believe are in the audience. One is for those of you who are interested in taking a course abroad at ESU, not necessarily a Swedish course, a course in Sweden, although the one that I'm teaching, that I'm talking about tonight, is also being taught next summer, but also to think what the opportunities are in general in taking a course here at ESU. Then we're also hoping to speak with audience members tonight who are interested in forming a course by themselves and getting one going here at ESU. And then finally, we want to speak to an audience to talk to them about the research that Kelly has been able to conduct with her students in this country of Sweden. So to go through some of the steps that you need to go through if you are a person who is interested in establishing a course, if you're a professor, instructor, etc., is to find a host university. In this case, we selected the University of Lund University, and this is actually the classroom building that we had our classes in. And I selected this university along with Kelly because we've been traveling to Sweden for many years, and we have friends and family that were there, and actually one of my very first research projects was at this university using their library. It's very typical for universities to have programs set up for American students coming there in the summer. It is a revenue generator for them. So universities typically will have a program director in charge that you can speak to, and they can come up with costs for you based on what you're looking for. The options open to you are everything from classroom space that you need, to excursions that you want them to help organize, to local cultural sites, to guest speakers, to accommodations, to meal plans. It's all part of the negotiation, and this is where we chose Lund University. The town itself, just to give you a quick view of what it's looking like a classic European town. It's a town that has cobblestone streets. It's got lots of boutique shops, beautiful flowers, as European towns often have, hanging from flower baskets that the municipal government maintains, and just a lot of bustling activity going on in this town.
So some of you may wonder exactly where Sweden is and how we got there. So you can see the US is right here, and we traveled to Sweden, which is northeast at the very top. But the way that we got there was we went first to, and I don't have a thing to show you, but first we landed in Iceland. So that was a 5.5-hour plane ride to Iceland. We stayed in Iceland, so the students got to say, I've been in Iceland as well, which they were very excited about. And then we left Iceland and we went to Denmark. Denmark was about a 2.5-hour plane ride from Iceland. And when we arrived in Denmark, we took a taxi across the bridge, because you can see there's a waterway there, to go to Lund. And that is where we stayed for the next 2 weeks. And we traveled back, and we'll show you some pictures of where some of the excursions, because we did end up going back to Denmark, which is a lovely country in itself. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But that's where we landed, was Lund, and that's how we got there from the US.
All right, so this is a page that we're not expecting you to read because of the font type, but we just wanted to introduce to you the next stage in getting a course together after you find a host university, assuming that you've contacted them and you've reached some understanding of the costs, et cetera, is to develop a budget for your program. Your budget should include the costs that the host institution wants you to pay, and then also you want to include yourself in the program as the instructor. So you have to divide by however many people you expect to get in the course, and typically 10 students is a target minimum, and to go up higher is up to the administration for how many students are required. I want to have this person who is in the office that this page is speaking to just stand up momentarily. He's Steve Ives. He's the director of the Office of International Programs, and just ask him to introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Steve Ives. Like Dr. McKenzie said, I'm the director for the Office of International Programs. I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to go with Dr. McKenzie last year. We spent some time, we set a Reykjavik, Iceland, Denmark, and Sweden. It was an unbelievable opportunity for our students and for myself. Actually, my capacity not only was as the director, I actually went as a grad student and took the course, and Dr. McKenzie was actually great mentor in a lot of ways, not only on the trip, but also walking me through setting up how he's been doing it for 20 years, 25 years. So he kind of gave me some pointers, and certainly a great person to go to. So yeah, thank you, Dr. McKenzie. I do have to run to the etiquette dinner, so but thank you for having me. And hopefully, see, my office is Stroud 103. For the students, please come see me, and be more than happy to help you out.
Okay, so the budget goes to Steve Ives in the Office of International Programs. Keep in mind that airlines do discount if you have 10 students or more. So it's a whole separate process for booking airline tickets. You contact them, you get a contract offer, and you get a 10% discount. Also included in that for many airlines, I've worked with many airlines over the years, they all have different rules in this area, is the idea of deviations. Deviations is where 2 or 3 or 4 people, it's usually a percentage of how many people are traveling, get to deviate from the departure date or the return date. And that allows you, if you're a professor, to bring along family members who contribute their own, they pay for their own plane flight and their own accommodations, et cetera, but they can join in with the group as Kelly and I have done. And yes, it is very strange to be married and working at the same place, but at least I get to drop off coffee through her window, and when I get complaints in email, I just forward them to her and say, this must be for you. All right, so the proposal goes to the Office of International Studies, and then it goes up through the dean, at least in my college, and then it goes to the provost. And in our case, we've had a provost since she's started here who's been very supportive of international affairs. She has, in the past, been able to allocate some funding, which is going towards reducing the cost for the students because the benefits are so many. And we're going to get that across now as we start to move into, this is budget figures. I only want to show you not everything in detail here, but this is the extent of the detail that's needed for the budget. So it's not pages and pages that you have to get together. And then these are emails that I send out to students. Again, I'm not expecting you to read this. Communicating with students, update number 1, update number 2, update number 3 as students join the course, because recruitment goes on all year long. And this is the flyer that I used. It's very important to have a flyer that is eye-catching. Again, I'm not expecting you to read over the information here. We're actually going to be highlighting the excursions, which are listed on this flyer, as we go through the photos very shortly here. But the flyer is a key tool in recruiting for the course. And then when it comes time for students to want to sign up, you have to have a payment plan and an inducement for them to get involved and make a commitment. So that's a deposit. That's $300 for ours. And then it goes on to $1,300, and then $1,000 or $1,100 to $1,200. The cost of the course is around $2,800, give or take. This next year it is $2,800. And this payment slip is the next step to get students to commit and start to build the excitement about the course.
So this is us leaving East Stroudsburg University. Everyone was very excited. It was a bit of a rainy, cold day, but we're all looking forward to going to Sweden so you can see how happy they all are to leave the US and take on a new adventure. This is inside the classroom, so this is where Dr. McKenzie taught students. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? It's in the building that you saw initially.
They're looking very serious here because they know that they have a quiz in a few minutes, so they're all cramming right before they're getting ready to take that. This was at the School of Journalism in Lund University. It's spelled L-U-N-D, but it's pronounced Lund University. It's the second most prestigious university in Sweden, and we held class in here from 9 until 11:45 every single day, which then opens up the afternoons for excursions, and we'll be showing photos from those momentarily.
So I put this in here because I was fascinated by this idea. How many of you students know what a coffee break is? Okay, so how many of you take them on a regular basis? Well, in Sweden, a fika is a coffee break, and they take it very seriously. So every day in the class, they would have for the students cookies and coffee, and it would be a time that they were able to chat with each other, and it is what is done in Sweden, is that you are expected to have a fika during the day where you take time out of your busy day, you meet with colleagues or friends, and you have your coffee or tea, and you also have pastries. So I found that very interesting, and every day the person who was helped to organize the trip in Sweden brought that to the classroom for the students.
Yeah, when I saw fika in the budget that Lund University sent me, I thought it was a cultural tradition, but I didn't realize it was part of this snack that they were wanting every day with cookies. Here's outside of the classroom. We took warrior stuff with us. We wanted to make sure that we felt united and proud about East Stroudsburg University, and also to have some things to show people when we came back.
And you can see that sometimes people worry about the weather in Sweden because they think it's going to be overcast most of the time, but it was lovely. The weather was beautiful.
You know, the Swedes, they have a great sense of humor, and they're such a sensible people. You know that even if you go into IKEA, as they say it, or IKEA, as we say it. But speaking about the weather, one of their sayings is, there's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothes. And that, in a way, sums up a lot of how the Swedes think.
So here is the Grand Hotel, and the Grand Hotel is right in the middle, almost in the middle of Lund. And this was a classroom site which the students really enjoyed going to.
Yeah, we had a need to study cable television. While we were there, the course that I was teaching is called Comparative Media, CMST 410, Comparative Media. And we studied media systems from around the world. And actually, as Jem mentioned in the outset here, I included in my book many countries, including Sweden, and actually much of my original research was done at Lund University to help write my material on Sweden. So when it comes time to study cable television, we needed to have a place that we could go, so we rented a room in the Grand Hotel for 1 hour. Sounds funny, renting a room for an hour, but it was for classroom purposes.
And also, this was an interview site for one of the students I worked with. So when I went to Sweden, I worked with 2 students on independent studies. One independent study was about communication and the tourism industry in Sweden. The other independent study was looking at gender and sexism in Sweden. So the first one was for that student, well, let me go backtrack a little bit. So independent studies, if you're not aware of what those are, an independent study is where you want to have an interest in studying something, and you want to work with a professor who has an expertise in that area to reach the goals of what you would like to study. So the one student I worked with, she was very interested in the tourism industry and how they communicated effectively or differently than perhaps in the US. And so I started to work with her on that and how we were going to go about studying that. So what I did was I gave her a list of books that she was going to read, and then I gave her some questions or prompts for each of her readings. So, and part of her independent study was she had to interview 3 people in Sweden from different types of tourism industries and talk to them about what is their philosophy, how do they see they communicate differently with different groups of people from different countries, and also how the tourism industry is changing and what are some of their biggest challenges. So she interviewed someone at the Grand Hotel. She also interviewed a woman who had owned this small little shop. It was just such a quaint little shop full of handmade Swedish goods. And she had owned this shop for many, many years. And she also interviewed a third person at another small shop. And then she presented in Dr. McKenzie's class her findings. The other student I worked with, we actually worked together on research. Can you go to the next slide? So what we did was I met with her, she discussed what her interests were, I discussed with her what my expertise was, and how we could join together to do a research project. When she was talking about her research project, I said, this might be a possibility for a grant opportunity. So we decided that we would apply for a summer grant, and she did receive it. So she received $2,000, which of course is very helpful when you want to travel to Sweden. And there were a couple things that we had to do. She had to do a literature review, which is she had to read a lot and figure out exactly what she wanted to hone in on what were some of the key issues in the research area that she wanted to look at. And then we developed some research questions. And the research questions were based on the perception of sexism in the US in comparison to the perception of sexism, or the perception of sexism among Swedish students in comparison to the perception of sexism among American students. So we looked at a group of American students who were traveling to Sweden. They were our experimental group. And so we gave them a survey prior to their leaving the US. And then we gave them a survey as they were returning to the US. And then we had Swedish students who we interviewed as well. And then when we came back to the US, and we gave them also this survey, and when we came back to the US, we gave a survey to a control group who did not go to Sweden. And we gave it to them, we gave them a pre, and then 2 weeks later we gave them a post, just like we did the experimental group who traveled to Sweden. So, can you go to the next? So, we had some difficulties when we arrived in Sweden. So we talked to the person who was our liaison in Sweden, and that person said, this will be fine. I got permission from the university to do the research there. But when we arrived, we had a little bit of a snag, and that was that there were hardly any students at the university. There were courses at the university that were taking place, but we learned very quickly that the professors were mostly teaching online, even though they were courses that were being held at the university. So that kind of put a kink in our plan, and we thought, how can we get students? So we started asking people, where can we find students? And so they would tell us, go to the CAF. We'd go to the CAF, we'd sit and wait and see if we could find students. And then we would go to the bookstore and see if we could find students. But this is where we found the most students of all. Do you have any idea what this could be? It's a gym. That's where we found most of our students. So we sat in the lobby of the gym, and as people came in, we would ask them if they would consider being interviewed. We'd ask them if they're Swedish. We'd ask them if they're a student at Lund University, and that's where we got most of our students. So one thing about research is sometimes it is very difficult to get people to participate. Don't give up. Think think creatively. Where can you find people? So here's just some of the findings, some things that we found. Americans were more hostile and more benevolent in terms of their sexism than were Swedes. So benevolent sexism is different than hostile sexism, because hostile sexism is derogatory, demeaning behavior toward women. Whereas benevolent sexism puts women on a pedestal and says, you're actually a better sex than men. You are superior to men. And so we were looking at, do they think that women are in some ways better than men are, and do they put them on a pedestal as being, the sex that has more value and are, they're like angels. And we found out that Americans exhibited both hostile and benevolent sexism at greater frequencies than the Swedes. That was expected. Previous research has found that. What was not expected was that the experimental and the control group became more hostile after the 2-week period. And so that's something we're still trying to work on. Why is that? Why would American students, and it was a kind of an interesting thing, because the American students were traveling back to the US, and that's when we took surveys, and they exhibited more hostile, the questions that they answered on the survey, they exhibited more hostility toward women than when they had left the US. And when we did it here in a classroom, it was an intercultural communication course. The same thing happened in that 2-week time period. Was initially, they didn't exhibit as much hostile sexism as they did later in the 2-week time period. So we don't know. Is it because they were in a transition period? Is it because it was, coming back to the U.S. and maybe that heightened experience of stress coming back home? Maybe in a 2-week time period in a university environment, what happens during that time frame that might increase that. That's something we're still trying to work out. The experimental group, now this was also very interesting, became less benevolent, and the control group became more benevolent. So in other words, those students who traveled to Sweden actually became less benevolent towards women than those students who stayed here in the US. So that means that they didn't see women as necessarily, being on a pedestal any longer, being the better sex. But for some reason, the control group actually increased substantially. So we're still trying to figure out why that is too. So this was our research that we did, and we think we found some pretty interesting things.
One of the advantages to a student doing an independent study during a summer study abroad program is financial, at least to start, and then of course the knowledge that you get is something that you realize was in your interest all to begin with. But what I'm saying is, if you are on financial aid, there's a requirement for most of you to do 6 credits in the summer. So if your summer study abroad program is 3 credits, then another possibility is for you to arrange a 3-credit independent study to get to 6 credits. Speaking of other things that you want to happen when you study abroad is you want the students to get off of the campus and out of the classroom and starting to mix, not just with themselves, because there will be a tendency for the students to want to stick together, but to start to mix with the Swedish culture in this case or wherever you are. And for this particular program, we had 2 student mentors that were part of our program costs. They were Swedish students. Actually, one of them was Mexican studying at Lund University, but it's all for the good because the more international contact students are getting, the better. So to show you some of the things that the students got to experience, I would like to go into some photos now that are around Lund. And the one on the top left-hand corner is nothing spectacular other than to show that you start to see in Sweden that they love the color yellow. There are so many different colors of yellow all over Sweden and so many houses that are painted yellow, and even yellow is in their flag. That's why we have the blue and the yellow here. Kelly, you chose the one underneath.
Yeah, this was actually by the university. Do you remember this, Kelsey and Fiona? Kelsey and Fiona, they were in Sweden with us, and this was had shops in it, and the students would go there frequently, and they were just looked really almost medieval, the buildings, and that's the one thing that's beautiful about Lund as well. There's new buildings, there's old buildings, there's a lot of museums. It's really a wonderful place, but yet it's a very manageable city for students. It's not something that you feel overwhelmed by. This, I wanted to include this because this was the favorite coffee shop of the students. They went there almost every day to get a coffee before we took a trip or before they went to class. And this is the university grounds. It's just a really beautiful university with a lot of walking paths. And in the university itself, they have museums, which is very nice too.
So I would like to spontaneously ask Kelsey, I don't think she'll mind, if she could just comment on the typical routine of students in the morning. I'm sure it involved the coffee shop for you, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Can you just would you mind standing up and just telling people what your typical routine would be while you're taking the class?
Yeah, usually we'd meet up in groups and take the bus together, and then we would go to the coffee shop and we'd walk there and then walk to class and usually catch up on some reading.
Okay, great.
How would you rate the coffee?
That was good. I didn't get too many coffee. A lot of people said it was pretty strong. I got tea.
So speaking of transportation in the bus, we wanted to put this up here because also the amazing thing about Europe and Sweden in particular in Lund is that you can get around so easily. You can go to another country by train very quickly and easily. The students had what was called a JoJo card, which allowed them to, it was part of the fee, it allowed them to take the bus to many different parts of Sweden, and it also allowed them to take the train. They could go all the way up to Stockholm. They could go to Denmark on the train. So it was a really great way of the students having that freedom. And I haven't seen this in a lot of other trips where they had a lot of freedom to go a lot of different places on their own and feel very safe, and it was very convenient for them.
Yeah, so Sweden is known for, among other things, being very engineeringly advanced. They have auto manufacturers that you probably know about. You probably know about Saab and Volvo. They also make a lot of airline parts, and they're just very advanced technologically, and that shows up in their public transportation. This is actually a slow train. They have a fast train that goes to Stockholm, 270 miles an hour. But this bus right here is a good example. You go wait under a bus stop in Sweden, and it's got the electronic marquee above it telling you how many minutes away the bus is. So you're never worrying, is my bus coming 1 minute away, 2 minutes away? And you hop on, and it lowers itself to the ground for people who may have a disability and get on the bus, and some of them have wireless and take you all around.
And this is the Swedish countryside. So right outside of Lund, probably about a 15-minute bus ride. You're in the country, and it's very beautiful, bucolic, lots of greenery, lots of fields with growing various vegetables and wheat. And This was a walk. We took the bus every day to Lund University, and then we would arrive at the bus stop and walk into a neighborhood to where we were staying. And it was just a very beautiful way. It was a very beautiful walk, very, like I said, bucolic, beautiful fields that you would go by on the bus.
Sweden also is defined by its interest in nature and conservation. So you will find it very difficult to see polluted places in Sweden. Even finding a cigarette butt is unusual. They take great care of their country, and even my friend that I visit over there, they don't even have fluoride in their water. They use the well that's right in the neighborhood, and they keep the neighborhood from being polluted. And that also goes for the produce that they grow. They have very strict laws about wheat and vegetables when they're harvested, how quickly they have to be freeze wrapped and distributed to producers. It's an amazing country how organized it is. And also in the countryside even, you will find another signature of Sweden and really all of Scandinavia, including Denmark, and that is the bike path. And people riding bikes of all ages and walks of life. And bike paths not just going through cities, but going through countryside like this here and being clearly marked. There's always a priority towards alternative methods of transportation other than the vehicle in Sweden and other European countries as well.
This was actually, I think, one of the favorite things that the students did. We have friends in Sweden that they've been our friends for many years, and they invited the students to come to dinner at their house, and they made them all dinner. And so they got to see a Swedish home, they got to meet Swedish people, they got to meet Swedish teenagers, a Swedish college student, and they got to eat Swedish meatballs, which is typical of Swedes. And they also got to have a lot of different types of food, which was different than they would typically have, in the U.S. So they really enjoyed it, and it was in the countryside. So they were in the town. They took a bus out to the countryside, and it was just a really magnificent experience. They did not stop talking about it, and our friends loved it too, because they loved talking about their country to the American college students.
What's amazing to me when I look at this photo on the left is this was just minutes after I berated the entire class for going out and drinking way too much our first night in Sweden. So I did want to introduce that is something that as the instructor professor you do have to deal with. Our culture, you can have your own interpretation obviously, but it does obviously repress alcohol, legal alcohol use till the age of 21, so there's a lot of pent up demand, shall we say, when you go abroad. And even in my class, I had a very strong talk with them at the Iceland airport about, Swedes, they have a strong diet of alcohol. They have an alcohol, it's a vodka, aquavit, it's a spicy vodka, and they pass it around during celebration. So I warned the students about that, but the tendency was there for them to go out and really let it loose the first night. So right after, we had this talk at this house, and here they are all smiling, which is amazing for me to see. But I also want to mention that after that talk, there was no problems for the rest of the class. It was a very enjoyable class to have. But it's the reality, professors. You have to really stay on top of that. And even then, it's not necessarily a guarantee that will go that well. All right, so what we're looking at here now is we're starting to get into the excursions that we took. These are the combination of the cultural experience with some of the things that we're learning about in the classroom. And what we're looking at here is actually a Viking village that was recreated. It was not too far away. And we've got some video here. We're just going to show a minute of the students playing this ancient Viking game called Kubb, K-U-B-B. It's got like a combination of bowling and chess. And the idea is to try and knock these blocks down. Volume is here.
That's all about.
It's the little simple things when you're abroad. They're not spending money. They're not having to eat something. They're not having to pay an entrance fee to the museum was this village was included. But to get them involved in simpler things with less commercialism is kind of what Swedish culture is already like to begin with.
Go ahead.
All right, so this excursion was to what is called Kronborg, but what is more commonly known as Hamlet's Castle, because this is where Shakespeare wrote Hamlet. And here we are as a group standing outside. This was in Denmark. So this involved a very fun journey where we took a train to a ferry and then took a ferry, which if you've never ridden on one, the European ferries are very big and they have restaurants on them and you can't even tell that you're on a boat in some ways. They're like a floating hotel. And it goes across the strait over to Denmark, 25-minute ride. And then we went to Kronborg Castle. And we had a ticket that was going to give us a guided tour. And this turned out to be a very special guided tour because once we got in the middle of the courtyard of the castle, we're waiting and waiting and waiting on this person who's going to show up with a name tag to take us on the tour. And suddenly this guy here with his back to us and the fluffy white sleeves comes racing out with the sword. And he starts to call up to the king who's up in the second floor of the castle. And the king beckons him to come up and have a duel. So he goes chasing up and he asks us all to follow him. And the rest of the tour was all like that. It was all in character in the castle. All right, now to an excursion that is a little bit more in line with the content of the course, comparing media from around the world. What you have here are a couple photos from a newspaper excursion that we took. We went to a newspaper in the south of Sweden. It's one of the most important newspapers in all of Sweden, even though it is a regional newspaper and not a national newspaper. And on the left, we have the editor-in-chief. And the editor-in-chief spending 2 hours with us, taking us on a tour of his facility for free. It's not something that you find so much in American media. That in itself is something that we make an observation about when we take this course, because American media are under more of a crunch of time because of various factors. But in the Swedish culture, there is time to take people through media facilities. So the students really got to see a lot of different departments in the Swedish newspaper, and we ended up in one of the most advanced functions of a newspaper that I've ever seen. I've taken my students on lots of newspaper tours. What you're looking at on the right, I'm not expecting you to read, but what it is it is a list of all of the stories that appear in the digital version of this newspaper, and all the way on the right-hand side, those numbers that you can't read, that's the number of people who are reading that story right now in real time. So you can imagine what that presents to you in the digital age as a person wanting to know your media audience. You can really learn specific information right now about who's looking. And these numbers were fluctuating, right? As people moved on to the next story, the numbers were flipping. And it gives the newspaper the ability to see which story are we predicting will be the most popular and which story is actually the most popular. All right, and then the last excursion, at least as part of the daily afternoon excursion selection that we had, was a trip to something that we have here at ESU. It was a trip to a business incubator, which is located in that red brick building behind us there. And inside this business incubator, you had very young startup Swedish companies. Sweden is a very entrepreneurial country. They've invented things like the milk carton, that we drink out of, and we open up and it turns a little triangle that's the spout. That was a Swedish invention. And they're constantly trying to stimulate invention. And so in this building, you would have not big companies of 20, 30, 40 people, not like that. Sometimes it was just a desk with a chair, and then that person had access to wireless, to databases, to sales advice, to consultation. So it was fascinating to take students like these two right here through that business incubator and show them that innovation is going on around the world.
So we were fortunate enough to also go to one of the happiest countries in the world, which is Denmark. And we went to the capital of Denmark, Copenhagen. This is the train station that we arrived in Denmark. It was a very beautiful old train station right in the middle of the city. And again, just like Sweden, very convenient. As soon as you walk out of this train station, you can get on a bus and go to various parts of the city by bus. When we arrived, it was raining, and I mean a downpour of rain. But we were determined to see some of the best sights that Copenhagen has to offer. So we ended up going to see The Little Mermaid. So can you imagine standing in the pouring rain? Nonetheless, it was a really beautiful place to be.
Yeah, Copenhagen means safe harbor. it's a harbor, and you're safe when you arrive. And believe me, when you're going through those waters, those frigid waters in that part of the world, you feel pretty good when you enter this harbor, is how I would imagine it. And one of the most familiar icons has been adopted by Disney, again, something that we talk about in this course, because it's media content now, is the Little Mermaid.
So this is New Haven, which is New Harbor. It's a very nice area of Copenhagen where you can go and have something to eat. On the right-hand side, on the left, are different types of historical buildings. The wonderful thing about this area on that particular day when it was raining and cold is that you walk into one of the restaurants and you immediately go down the steps into a very warm, cozy space, and you can get warm and have something nice to eat and to drink in that area. It did clear up though, and we were able to ride some bikes, and that is also not only in Sweden but also in Copenhagen. Many people get around by bike. There's a bridge that is just for bikes that goes across the canal, and I forget how many bikes they said go across that per day, but it's like in the thousands of bikes, and every day they count how many bikes go across.
Yeah, the bicycle is a big part of life in all of Scandinavia, as I mentioned earlier, but also a big part of life in Scandinavia, as well as some other cities like Amsterdam or Strasbourg in Germany, is the intermingling of foot traffic and car traffic and water traffic. It's difficult to realize until you actually go to another place, and you can get this in the US, like Fort Lauderdale, for example, how much of an interference and imposition car noise is. You know, from the taxi horns that you hear to the diesel engines to trucks downshifting to cars just in general, they make a lot of noise. So when you get in a city like this one here, Copenhagen, which has a lot of waterways, it's a completely different feeling. And for me anyhow, it's more relaxing and tranquil, and it's all part of what we want our students to experience.
And of course, the cuisine. Swedish cuisine is fabulous. It's very natural food. They're very much into making sure that the things are sort of farm fresh. So when we were staying at our friend's house, every day we had fresh strawberries and eggs that came from the farm. And the Danish cuisine is similar, except for the sausages, which Rob loves, the sausages. And they sell these on the street. They are delicious. And they sell them in all kinds of ways. So this is one way in which they sell them, is just by putting them in a bun. But they also sell them where they have them in the bun already. And it's like a pretzel bun around it. And you see people all over eating these sausages. And then there is
So the picture on the right is the typical, it's the classic, I should say, Danish cuisine that you have. It's called the smørrebrød, is the best that I can remember how to pronounce it, smørrebrød. And it's a sampling of things which always is going to include the staple of Danish cuisine, which is herring. I don't know if you've had a chance to eat herring. The way that it's sold in the US is not really a good representation of the way that herring is sold and served in both Sweden but more so in Denmark. The herring is a very delicate fish that it's not chewy and it's not super salty. And in fact, what they do is they serve it with at least usually 3 different kinds of sauces that you have your choice of. One is going to be a cucumber sauce, the other is going to be a straight vinegar sauce, and the other was going to be a curry sauce, like an Indian curry sauce. So the Danish smørrebrød is always going to have herring in it, and it's going to have all these other things in it which we don't have as part of our diet, but which are both tasty, at least most people think they are, and also really good for you, like chopped beets. You can see it in the red in there. And the bread is very natural, and it's just a wonderful thing to do. In fact, Copenhagen has become much more recognized as a place to dine in Europe.
And this was our last excursion, and probably, I think, just like going to our friends' homes for dinner, one of the most special, and that was going to the Swedish restaurant and sauna. The sauna is very Swedish. You go into the sauna and you get very warm, and then you walk down steps into the North Sea and you go for a swim. The North Sea is very shallow, so we walked, as you can see, you walk out on this pier, and on the right-hand side is the sauna for the women, on the left is the sauna for the men. And so you go into the sauna. It was kind of initially challenging for our students because when you go into the sauna, people are naked. And so our students went in fully clothed, but the women in Sweden, to them, it's very natural. And so you're having a conversation and it's very natural for them. And it took a little bit of time for the American students to feel comfortable with that. But they had an enjoyable time. Can you imagine sitting in a sauna and then going for a swim in the North Sea? I think they spent about an hour just going in the sauna for a swim, in the sauna for a swim. And then once we were finished with the sauna, we had dinner in the restaurant that was as you can see, out in the North Sea.
Yeah, you can imagine what a special experience this is for the students, and it also fits right in, again, with Swedish culture, and we're also putting in with this Finnish culture, Finland culture, as well as Danish culture, and Iceland culture, and Greenland culture. They're all considered, by most people anyhow, to be part of Scandinavia. And the idea is to take care of the skin involves sweating out a lot of impurities that you do in a sauna. So you go into this tiny room and it's all wood inside and they have the rocks and you have the heat that's coming up and you're sweating profusely, and then you go down the stairs right into the water and those pores close up when you get into the cold water. So there's actually a tradition behind this way of caring for the body that goes back centuries in Sweden. Mm-hmm. And even people of modest means in Sweden, they usually have a summer house. And that summer house may be only as big as what some of us may have for a family room, but it's got a sauna inside of it and a place that you can go down and open up those pores. And then the final experience as the meal that we had as a restaurant, and to have a formality to it, and to allow this to be a platform for students to stand up and talk about what they learned or what they enjoyed from the experience. It's a great way, I've found, to allow students to bring closure to their time that's coming to an end. Many students have gone through kind of homesickness phase, and they've become acclimated to Sweden, and they're really regretting getting ready to go home because of all the things that they'll face when they get back with work and pressures, et cetera. So to have a formal experience with a dining experience is something that is a great way to end
and it was
a summer
really
study abroad
surprising to me on this trip how many students would say to me, I've never had an experience like this in my life. Having a dinner like this. I've never done that in my life, and it was very special for them. Or going on the ferry. I've never been on a ferry in my life. And how special that and meaningful for them that is. Or I've never been on a train. I've never been able to travel by bus and then get on a train and go somewhere else. So they had a lot of really special experiences.
Yeah, I mean, not to be too self-complimentary, because this could be said probably by any student that goes on any study abroad experience, but we asked Kelsey what she thought of the course, and this is what she said: it was the best decision of my life. And she's not an obvious major for the course. She's a business management major. So this is our contact information. We had planned on opening this part up to questions or comments if you've traveled and you want to share your travels or anything else you want to throw out there. That's what this is for. Maria.
I just want to know, do you know what the poverty rate is in Sweden? I mean, you always think of Sweden as this really nice, almost perfect place. But I'm sure they do have some poverty there, but I don't know.
Well, actually, that's in my book, and I'm trying to remember, and even then it's going to be a little bit outdated by now, but poverty is very low and literacy is very high. It is a socialist country, and they do have a much less wide gap between the rich and the poor than you find in the United States. So that means that you don't find abandoned houses, you don't find drug houses, you don't find homeless shelters, because anybody can have a place to sleep that the government will subsidize. But it also means you don't see mansions. You don't see really huge 40,000 square foot homes. You don't see that kind of thing in Sweden.
Rob, how many students, you didn't mention the total number, because I was impressed how many students you brought.
We had 19 last summer. Kelsey joined very late in the game, right, Kelsey?
Yeah. I was originally going to go to Germany, and so that would have been by myself, and Steve showed me this trip, and I thought much more.
And it was the best decision.
Yeah.
Right. That's great.
How many of
That's
you?
I'm really impressed about the number, and just so you know, from my perspective, and Rob knows this, we definitely want at least one faculty member to go with every 10 students. You know, in this case, we had the benefit also of Steve going as a student who also knew about international. Looks like his whole family was there, though. So I guess he was busy with those two little boys, right? As well.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, he had 2 young children. You saw one in the.
I don't know if you've met Steve's children. They are a bundle of energy. You know?
Well, that was the nice
Adorable,
thing,
a
too.
bundle of energy, right?
It was nice to have that family there too. I think the students felt like we were all sort of connecting a lot because of the family environment too. So that was kind of nice. And Steve's children, the students, I really enjoyed them.
I got one more question. About the cuisine and the herring. Is it all pickled herring there, or do they actually
Oh,
eat
there's-
fresh herring?
There's a lot of different types of herring.
Type of what?
They're-
I'm sorry, what did she ask?
Is it all pickled herring, or is there fresh herring there? Do they eat fresh herring as well?
Yeah, they had fresh herring. They had fresh herring with curry. What else? But most of it is
Pickle?
pickled, or with some kind of sauce.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by fresh, but it's raw. So.
Well, fresh in the sense that they don't put any pickling chemicals on there.
Yeah.
You
No, the
capture it,
pickled
you
is the
fry it.
one kind of sauce. The curry sauce is another kind. The pickled is absorbed by it. The other one is on top of it.
Because I had a friend from Sweden, and he had to get his pickled herring from the stores there. And the herring itself out of the jar was okay. But when he combined it with his sour cream dill and a potato, and he said you have to do all 3.
You
The
do.
taste became amazing.
When we ate at when
Yeah.
we ate in Copenhagen, we sat next to a couple, and they were instructing us on how to do it. And the instructions included a sip of that vodka that I talked about. Because it's taken to, they say, to break up the food inside of you. It's a digestive that they say. But you're making me really hungry
Yeah.
right now. I want to introduce Matt. He was in the course. I know you didn't catch the rest of it, Matt, but is there anything that you would like to add about what you experienced last summer?
What you talk about?
Yeah, I can't really
Oh, we
go
don't wanna
over.
go back
I can't go
over
over
it,
it again.
Matt.
Just speak what spontaneously comes to you.
Whatever you want.
People you meet are unbelievably friendly. The weather there is kind of iffy, but when it's nice, it's absolutely beautiful. The college is one of a kind, I'd say. I've never been to anywhere like that. The people you are going to go with, you are going to be close together for the rest of your life, even after college. You're still going to be in contact with. Try everything, save up, and have fun.
Yeah, can I ask something of the 2 students? There are 2 that went on the trip, right?
I went on the trip too.
So 3. All right. Is this your first international experience?
Yeah.
For you it was, Matt.
Yeah, for the most part.
All right. And
By
this-
myself, at least.
For the ones, for the first time, are you looking to go someplace else internationally now?
Definitely, yeah.
The situation comes up, sure, yeah.
Well, we have a trip of China that they're trying to put together too, you know.
Yeah.
I'm sure Steve, but I think what is exciting, one of the hopes is by doing this course-embedded trip that is short. How many days was it? You were on the longer ones.
The first week is online, so you can take it whether you're living down the shore in Philadelphia, and then it's the next 2 weeks that are in Sweden.
And so we have trips that go abroad tied up to courses that are anything from a week to 2 weeks. But we find this gives students a taste of what it's like to travel abroad, because we really ideally like to see you think of spending a semester abroad, or go to another trip that's like this. So I'm glad it seems to be working.
How many of you are students in here who are interested in taking a study abroad class? Do we have any students in that category? Okay, where are you interested in going? Yeah. You don't know yet. You just want to go somewhere? Okay, do you have a top 2 countries? China sounds interesting.
Yeah, Tim Connolly is the person organizing that, and that's a fabulous trip too. I'm very proud of all our trips.
Where are you interested in going?
I was going to go to the Costa Rica one.
Okay, Kelly's been to Costa Rica.
Yeah, very nice.
So Julie is actually interested in the Sweden course. I wonder, Julie, if you have a question for either Matt or Kelsey or Fiona?
I actually talked to Matt yesterday.
Okay.
about it. Yeah.
Okay, great.
So I did not travel until after I got out of college, and that was one of my biggest regrets. I wish I had traveled while I was in college, because when I traveled for the first time out of college, I just loved it. It just opens the world to you, because I think as Americans, at least my first time, I was very nervous. I thought,
Great. I'll tell the side story. I had the opportunity of traveling. I've been abroad with my family, but I had my first year in college. So an 18-year-old girl going to France, had a wonderful time, and I bought my first bikini. And that was a big deal at my time. And, I borrowed money to buy that. But it is really an incredible opportunity, and it just getting to meet different people and different cultures, from the food to the people, are just phenomenal. And I'm sure the students that are here today that have done it can attest to that.
There is actually a very practical benefit for students other than all of the things that we've been talking about tonight, and that is, I can tell you firsthand, I have seen the resumes that get put forward to potential employers, and the ones that have Oxford University, where I've taught before, Lund University, China, Beijing University, where I've taught before, they pop out. They pop out, and they at least get you into the next stage of interviews, because employers are looking for people who have these experiences.
And Lund University is what, number 5 in the world or something like
Yeah.
that? So it's a pretty prestigious university.
I was just going to say, your presentation reminds me of my trip. I went to Russia. I was a visiting professor there for a semester, which was amazing. But it seems like in Sweden and in Russia, they do a lot of things the same. Vodka is very popular. They like saunas, although they beat you with a bush.
Oh, I saw that.
in the sauna.
They do that in Finland.
And yeah, I would highly recommend it to any students to go abroad.
Yeah, one more question here for Steve.
Is the study abroad, is it expensive? Like, how much is the program?
Well, my program is $2,800. Most of them are going to be around that $3,000 mark, and that is the program cost. Then you also have tuition. So that's where financial aid can come in. But there are scholarship opportunities. That's a reason to meet with Steve Ives in the Office of International Studies in Stroud 103 to find out about those opportunities.
And the one thing that Rob mentioned, for all the trips, at this point, I'm able to give, for each student going, a $500 discount towards it. And I worked that out with Steve Ives. So each trip is priced differently depending on where it is and how they can work it out, all right? But it's becoming much more affordable in the way they designed it. His budgeting process shows that.
Did you guys have a translator with you?
You know, Sweden is one of those cultures where they're, again, to come back to the content of the course that I teach, they're learning English at a very early age, not just from teachers, they're learning it from media. They watch television that has a black bar on the bottom of it. As a country with only 8-9 million people, they can't afford only to speak Swedish, so they use the opportunity of television to teach their population English, and so they'll bring in an imported program. Let's say it's Big Bang Theory from the United States, and then underneath they're going to have that black bar teaching. So when you go into a Swedish shop, you have only to say one word, hello, and they switch seamlessly into English. It's truly amazing, and I'm talking young and old people as well.
Can I just add something real quick? Our son, for the students going, he's a junior in high school, but this is going to be his second summer in Germany. And they too, he did it as part of an exchange group to begin with, but now those kids have become such friends, they travel back and forth now, and they get to stay in each other's house for free. So, you make these contacts, and in Germany too, they all speak English. So, he would have to learn German, but he's going over there for a whole month this summer.
Well,
and staying with 2 different families, so we don't have to pay for housing, which is lovely. but he gets to experience all that wonderful culture.
And that is a tradition in all of Europe, including Germany, Britain, France, etc. Is young people who have a place to stay over there, they know what it's like to be traveling and not to have enough money to stay in places that are going to cost a lot. So it's easy once you make friends with people in Europe, and I imagine so in Latin America, I have some experience in Mexico, that they're going to find a place for you to stay when you go. And that's going to take away huge costs, which is housing is very expensive.
But Laurie mentioned the word exchange. The other thing that I wish Steve was still here, we also have our students doing exchange programs, which is a whole semester, and you wind up, it's really well priced because you pay still ESU tuition, but you're going abroad for the 12 courses that you're taking. And they call them exchange courses for the semester. So if you're in, and we have, I would like to have more students, but we have students, we've had students go to China as an exchange student. We have had students go to Europe a lot as exchange students.
In my role as department chair of communication, I have 2 to 3 students per semester that are taking classes overseas, and they come and they say, I'm taking this class, can it count for a communication class here at ESU? And I can tell you that across the board, whether it's my department or other departments at ESU, we try to find a way for those courses to count. So if you look at a curriculum of another university and it's looking completely foreign to you, as it should, because it's a foreign university, don't think that you can't transfer that stuff back to ESU.
And I also want to add too, don't forget about independent studies, inquiring about that if you're traveling abroad. The 2 that I did were a lot of fun and very interesting. The students really learned a lot, interviewing people, talking to different people, and doing some research, figuring out how to do research, what does that mean, what are the steps in that, what is valuable when you're doing research, what isn't. So it's a great experience, especially in a different country. You get to learn a lot.
I'd like to ask if anybody else has any comments or questions. Well, I would like to let you know that we do have some materials on your way out if you're interested. We have a brochure for the Department of Communication if that's something that you're interested in. I have a flyer for the comparative media course being taught next summer, so that's there for you as well. And also the university newspaper, the Stroud Courier. I'd like to support the Stroud Courier and other campus media when we can. So if there are no other questions, we want to thank you very much for coming tonight.
Thank you.